Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Required Reading's Top 100. This week we are talking about Mary Beard's SPQR. So why is this a required reading for you?
Yeah, so the reason I recommend SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome by Mary Beard, is because she takes an approach that is very different from a lot of popular historians. And that is that she moves away from the great man theory to history. So the great man theory to history is where historians writing, and this is both academics and popular historians, tend to focus on so-called great men. So they tend to focus, especially in regards to Rome, they tend to focus on Julius Caesar, on Augustus,
Trajan.
on Trajan, on Marcus Aurelius.
Hadrian.
Yes, on Hadrian. Yes, exactly, on Hadrian. And or on Antony, for instance, Antonius, I forget his full name. Anyway, from Antony and Cleopatra. So they tend to focus on these sort of great men and their doings and the great battles and maybe some political intrigue and assassinations. And there's a tendency to focus on that and less so on the day-to-day lives of regular human beings, of individuals. And so she sort of pulls back away from that and says, hey, let's take a look at these other people. And this is how we can do that. And she actually doesn't tell you how she can do that, how we can do that, because that would be really boring. What she does is that she actually makes this really interesting. So she'll speak about certain people's lives and she'll use primary evidence, whether it's archaeology or inscriptions, or even in some cases, ancient literature. And she'll hone in on particular details about the lives of day-to-day people. And she does a really good job of doing that. And I think in doing this, she really helps bring this world to life. And one thing that I notice when I read histories, books about, again, ancient Rome, is that they become a litany of battles.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, my mind just shuts down. I'm just like, okay, here's another battle.
It reads as like listicles of like, and then in this year, and then in this year.
Yeah. And then this person, the son of this person did this, and this person and son of this person. And, and actually I'm trying to think of a book, because I remember, I was looking at this. For instance, kind of a great example of that is something like Age of Conquest. This book is about the Greek world from Alexander to Hadrian. So that's interesting, right? But in reading it, it really does sort of fall into, hey, this battle took place, and this person won, and this person then died, and then there's this person. And
so essentially you're dizzy with dates.
Yeah, you're dizzy with dates, you're dizzy with names, you just don't know who we're talking about and what's happening. And honestly, it's like I said, it's really dull stuff. The other thing that Mary Beard does is that she pulls away from this sort of clean, neat arc that oftentimes popular historians tend to take with Rome, which is that this is when Rome began, and they tell the sort of famous story about Romulus and Remus, and then some other sort of kind of famous story about there are a number of early kings, and then they sort of end with this notion of the fall of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. The first thing is that Mary Beard herself says that probably Romulus and Remus didn't exist. I don't know 100% agree. I think there's probably something like a person who might have been a kind of Romulus, but the sort of...
And Remus.
They were
twins.
They were twins, yeah. But I think that there was probably someone who maybe was, I don't know, the first person or one of the first people. Well, that's highly debatable.
Yeah, I think everybody needs a creation story. Everybody needs something to not necessarily create the meaning in their life, but create the purpose to why they exist and why the city exists. Yeah. So I think that creation myths are really, really powerful throughout society. So, I don't really think that you can go back and be like, oh yeah, these two brothers founded Rome. They were the first person on the Tiber River. Is that what?
The Tiber, yeah.
I highly doubt that. Anyways.
Yeah, and Mary Beard would agree with you. I'm less concerned with that necessarily than I am with the notion of when the Roman Empire ends.
Okay.
And that's something that people are obsessed with. And she doesn't really touch on it. I don't think that the Roman Empire really ever ended exactly. I think that it just kind of slowly changed into something else, which I think is what happens oftentimes. I mean, there are major events. For instance, the Russian Revolution ended a sort of Russia of a certain era, you could say. But it's not like Russia ever went away. You know, you still have this great landmass with a somewhat cohesive culture. And I think Rome is kind of similar. You have this sort of region with a sort of relatively cohesive culture that just slowly changed.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty normal. So she sort of pulls away from that and instead kind of focuses on this question that she has, which is that how did this sort of tiny backwater village become the great power that it would become? And I think this is a really great question because when you look at Rome, one of the interesting things about Rome is that in terms of the sort of great civilizations that existed around Rome in that period of time, in that region, Rome just wasn't really in anyone's mind. It wasn't, when the Greeks talk about the Greeks and talk about their world around 500 BCE, they don't talk about Rome. When they're talking about their world around 300 BC, they're not talking about Rome. When you see other sort of, when you talk about Egypt and when you look at Egypt and you look at Egypt's writings and their concerns about what was going on around their world around that time, they're not talking about Rome. Rome seems to emerge almost out of nothing. Rome itself is situated in an area that was really boggy and really swampy and was sort of disease-ridden. And around it, or really near them, was another society called the Etruscans, which were extremely powerful and who had active trade with the Greeks and who engaged with the production of great artifacts that are well known to us today. And so Rome just seems to appear out of nowhere. And this is one of the things that Mary Beard sort of tries to wrestle with. And again, my favorite part about this is, well, first of all, she's really a good writer.
Yeah.
She has a great sort of, she tells a really great tale. She really makes the story of Rome really interesting while moving away from, as I said, the sort of great man theory of Rome. The other thing, too, is that I think that nowadays, you know, we saw there was this really popular meme or whatever it was where women would turn to their husbands or their boyfriends and they would say like, oh, are you thinking about the Roman Empire?
Well, no, it was how often do you think
about
how often,
And
do you think about the Roman Empire?
And these guys would say like every day, and this led to this tremendous shock. Well, you know, I think there's theories as to why that is. Anyway, but actually, something that we don't realize when we think about Rome is that you can actually divide it into these sort of distinct, clear separators. And the Roman Empire is a very specific thing. Mary Beard isn't really talking about the Roman Empire in the way that I think a lot of people think of it, which is, again, attaching it to these great names, but rather something that came before the Roman Empire, which is the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic was something that is probably has had a more lasting effect on our society today than we even realize. And a lot of the sort of economic and governmental structures that we have in certain Western countries today were actually formed during the Roman Empire, during the Roman Republic, not during the Roman Empire. And although, again, she tends to sort of say, well, let's not get crazy. Our concept of our governmental systems aren't exactly like Rome, even though they may have some roots in Rome. So she sort of touches on some of these things, but also in the ways that we still use some of these like core phrases in today's world that actually come from this period of time. And so, yeah, I think she does a really great job of making this really approachable and enjoyable, but also kind of spinning or sort of changing our perception of how we should approach history, and especially the history of ancient Rome.
So we've been lucky enough, or at least I've been lucky enough to go to Rome 3 times. You have been more often. But I remember the first time that we went, we actually went with my parents, and it was really nice. Or I feel as though tourists in a city, and me included, we really like to know the stories. We really like to know like why things are here. And, like you were able to talk a little bit more to the history of Rome, I know my mom really appreciates when you tell stories and whatnot. And I know that the first time that we went, this wasn't published yet, but would you actually recommend or say that reading a type of book like this might be better for somebody who is going to travel to Italy or Rome specifically? Would it be better to read something like this rather than a travel guide? I know that like I love me some Rick Steves, but does this actually shape the experience a little bit more than perhaps like just sort of a to-do list?
So I think I wouldn't replace a good tour guide book with this, because obviously Rome, the city, and really any city that has ancient Roman roots, is so much more than just the ancient Roman roots. But if you're going to Rome, chances are pretty good that you're going to spend a lot of your time going to the Forum and going to the Colosseum and looking at, of course, churches and other sort of ancient artifacts there, and the museums, etc. So that said, I do think that this book is probably really one of the best for that, because for one thing, I think it really helps people understand. I think there's a tendency to go to Rome and sort of think like, wow, these people were amazing. They did these amazing things. Well, one of the interesting things is that the things that you're looking at in Rome that you sort of associate with ancient Rome, let's say, again, you associate with Caesar, you associate with Augustus. Most of the things that you're looking at in Rome, especially the marble columns, the great temples, they actually come after.
Well, what about the Colosseum? Is that
even the
after
Colosseum?
also?
Yeah, the Colosseum. Okay. So all of these structures are actually after the period of time that we're often sort of focused on. So, for instance, if you go look at the Parthenon, one of the great famous buildings, one of the most well-preserved buildings from ancient Rome, which is dedicated to Agrippa. That building was built, I think something like, that particular structure is built something like 100, 150, maybe even 200 years after the life of Agrippa. So he was never there to see that particular building. So what you see of Rome, what you think of when you look at these amazing buildings, they're well after the time of Caesar, and they're well after the time of Pompey, and they're well after the time of even Augustus. So this Rome doesn't really begin to emerge until Trajan and Hadrian, and sort of what's considered to be the great emperors of Rome, which there's some good ones and there's some bad ones. But anyway, I do think this book really helps inform your perspective of Rome. Mary Beard does take a sort of modernist, post-colonial view of Rome, and I think that's helpful. I think there's a tendency to look at Rome as being this great empire that did this, and I think it's good to remind us that things were kind of not great. There were some horrible things that were taking place at the time. But I think also because of our focus on some smaller details, like a particular kind of sarcophagus, for instance, or maybe a particular sort of statue or tombstone that we may just kind of overlook. Mary Beard does a really great job of saying, hey, take a look at this thing, and what does this tell us about people living in Rome at the time? And again, because of her focus on the little people, as it were, I do think it's great. I would recommend this as your sort of, outside of your guidebook, I would recommend this as a great book to help you engage with the city of Rome and its ancient structures and artifacts. Absolutely.
So you talked a little bit about that internet meme that was going on a couple of years ago with how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And I think that really did start to shine some light. Well, I mean, the light was already starting to be shined on this, but often history, like you were saying, kind of has the great men theory. And there has been for the last decade a little bit more focus on the women's roles in creating great empires. And there have been more books about, ancient Rome, but from the perspective of a woman, or ancient Rome from the perspective of a slave. And I know that Mary Beard does have, you bought me actually Women in Power, which was by Mary Beard.
Yeah.
It's a couple of lectures that she gave at various universities, or I'm not quite sure the location of these lectures, but it was really interesting. But I would love for you to talk about how Mary Beard approaches the topic of including women in the conversation of Rome in SPQR.
So Mary Beard, broadly speaking, does bring to light women's lives in the ancient world, and she does so in a really effective way. So one thing that you're often taught, especially if you study, let's say you take a course in ancient Rome in your bachelor's or anything like that, there's a tendency to say, well, these voices are unfortunately, they've been silenced, and they've been silenced through these different ways. So for instance, they'll say like, well, Cicero's written a lot. You can read his writings now. You can read the writings of, you can actually read the writings of Julius Caesar. You can read the writings. There's actually a famous writing, the Res Gestae by Augustus. And so there's this idea that women and people who are not elite men are completely and totally silenced. And this just isn't true. And it isn't true because while, unfortunately, there are very few large narrative or large form texts by women and by people who are not elite men, they're not completely silent. And the places that they tend to appear are often places they're not taught, unfortunately, in these classes, which I think is a failure of these classes, and I think is lazy. And that's that they appear a lot in inscriptions. Inscriptions, there are literally thousands and thousands of inscriptions in Latin in which the voices of women can be seen and heard. And there are also, in inscriptions, like for instance, tombstones, or that's really funerary. So funerary inscriptions are an example where you really start to see women emerge. Oftentimes women will have commissioned tombstones to be erected in which they celebrate their family. Women are mentioned in tombstones, sometimes by their husbands, in terms of what makes this such a great person. Oftentimes it is sort of limited to concepts of what makes a great woman, but they're there if you know where to look for them. And Mary Beard does highlight this. She highlights this in SPQR. She also highlights this in other books as well, where she'll sort of say, hey, look at this inscription. And so, for instance, she talks in a lot of the lectures that she did during this time, she actually talked about this very specific inscription that was found in Britannica in Britain, in which this Roman soldier was in Britain, and his name is, I forget what it is exactly, but Africanus is there. I might be mixing this up, but this was actually the inscription that I think about is that there was this man from Syria who was married to this woman named Regina or Regina. Regina means something like queen. Yeah. And he was Syrian, but she was Latin, and they were both from somewhere in the southern part of the Mediterranean. They got married, and they ended up in Britain, where this person was sort of these people. They were important in the region that they were living in, and these are the things that just kind of get overlooked because there's a focus. If you study Rome, if you just take a class, the tendency is to be like, to sort of say, oh well, Appian wrote this and Caesar wrote that, and that's all we know. And in fact, we know a lot more. It's just that we have to kind of cobble them together from different places. Oftentimes, most commonly, they come from places like these sort of funerary inscriptions, which are often, not always, most of the time it is men who sort of commission them, but sometimes women commission them as well. Or sometimes they're commissioned by people who were formerly slaves. And you start to see these stories emerge. For instance, there's an inscription that I worked on a few years ago that it's about this family. And most of the people named in this inscription are actually 4 women.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it was a mother, a grandmother, and 2 daughters. And it's about their lives. And you learn a lot. Their names, you learn a lot about them through this inscription. For instance, their names are these sort of Greekified Latin names. So what I mean to say is that the names are Greek, but they're written in Latin.
So they're Latinified Greek.
Yeah, Latinified Greek names. And the names are something like very lucky girl.
Yeah.
Or very beautiful woman. But these names are given to these people because they were probably Greek, but they were living in Rome and they were probably slaves. And at a certain point they became freed people.
Yeah.
And so Mary Beard in SPQR, in Women in Power, and other texts that she's written, what she does is she says, hey, let's, sure, Hadrian was the emperor at this time, but there are all of these people there that were doing things, who were helping the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic actually run underneath everything else that was sort of going on up top. And Mary Beard does a good job of reminding us that these people exist and that they're there and they had a lot to say.
So Mary Beard has retired from teaching. And I know that she's probably working, well, I don't know, but I assume she's probably working on more projects and, following a little bit more of her passion. And maybe she's actually less limited by her teaching schedule and everything. But she has really created, there's Mary Beard and then there's Sarah Pomeroy, is it? Yeah, so they've both kind of created this pathway forward for female scholars and female writers who are interested in the ancient Roman world or just maybe even ancient history in itself. So who would you say are the up-and-coming authors to pay attention to from the perspective of Mary Beard or from the perspective of Sarah Pomeroy?
Yeah. So in terms of up-and-coming female scholars, there are quite a few of them. I think that they're mostly these days operating actually in social media. So there's one really great YouTube page. She hasn't been as active on YouTube recently, but it's Dig It with Raven. Mm-hmm. She's a young archaeologist. That's really close to my heart because I do a lot of archaeology, and she has been doing a lot of really great stuff, specifically in the YouTube sphere. Now she's written a book, I think something to the effect of the Forgotten Civilizations or something like that. But she's really, actually, I think she's really good. Mary Beard is still quite active.
Yeah.
So, for instance, she's written some books recently.
Yeah, I'm not popping Mary Beard off the.
Yeah.
Off
the list. So recently she's written a book. She wrote a book called The 12 Caesars, which sort of actually kind of focuses on. It's actually a beautiful book and focuses a lot of.
Really heavy.
It's really heavy, yeah. But it sort of actually looks at certain objects related to the 12 Caesars and actually kind of debunks them a little bit because she thinks a lot of them are fakes. Yeah. Something that I agree with. She also wrote a book called The Emperor of Rome. So this is about the concept of the Emperor of Rome. And again, she comes at it from a very sort of I would say skeptical and inquisitive point of view. I think right now it's kind of big in the manosphere, maybe you could say, or the Broic sphere, to sort of really exalt these emperors. I personally think that's wrong, and I have my own personal reasons for that. That might be another video because it's a long conversation to have. But I think she comes at it from a very healthy perspective. I think that there are a lot of really great female scholars. It depends where you look. Emily Wilson, she's not quite young, but she is actually younger than Mary Beard. She's more she's more of a philologist, and she does a lot of translation. But I think she's doing a lot of great work in terms of how we reconsider Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad. Let's see. But I think that some of the best work being done on the ancient world right now by female scholars maybe is being done outside of the sphere of Rome.
Yeah.
One that I recently read that I'm doing another video on is, for instance, Moody al-Rashid. So Moody al-Rashid is a scholar born in Saudi Arabia, but currently teaching, I believe, in Oxford. And she, again, sort of centers women's stories. But again, and moving away from the great man theory approach, which is that she's looking at history from the perspective of what some of the archaeological remains, as well as cuneiform inscriptions. And when you start looking at these smaller texts, you start to see these voices emerge. Another one might be Selena Wisnam, who's also kind of working in the same sort of sphere. So again, looking at cuneiform. I feel like in Mesopotamia and in Assyria, Amanda Padani is another one. There are a lot of scholars working, younger scholars working at trying to sort of change the way that we view, or I say, it's funny because we often say change.
Yeah.
I think that's not quite accurate. I think expand is probably a better term. Expanding our understanding of the ancient world. You still have some very well-known scholars, people like Tom Holland, for instance, who are still writing these sort of books that are looking at the ancient world in a different kind of way, but still tending to look at it from, again, this sort of great man theory position.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of scholars now who are kind of saying, hey, there were these people who were merchants and slaves and women who were working in this world, and they've said something. They've left something behind. And there are quite a few, in addition to Mary Beard, who's still really, really active, who are doing that. And they're expanding also, not just from Rome, not just of Rome, but also across the entire ancient Mediterranean world.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today for Required Readings Top 100. Again, the book was SPQR by Mary Beard. If you've read this book before, please comment below. What do you think about Mary Beard's opinions? If you haven't read this book before, also comment on, hey, I'm going to pick this up. I'm really excited to read it. But we will be back next week with another Top 100. If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.